make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
It said, during the pandemic, fathers got closer to their children, and they don't want to lose that. And it was about how a lot of fathers don't want to go back to the office full time. You know, they'd like maybe a hybrid situation or something like that, so that they can keep that closeness. That, you know, they found out they liked their kids during the pandemic. I think that's a very positive development.
Yeah, so can we just I don't know, take a step back maybe and just define what does it mean to be masculine?
Well, you know what? This is a very fact-based book. You know, I give the facts of sociology, and I give a lot of historical facts. It's the most data-driven book I've written. And in fact, yesterday I was on a podcast, and the guy said, I never did figure out what your position was. Oh, good. Good. I wasn't writing to show my position. But it has been the most controversial book I've written, which did take me by surprise. I mean, my last book, which is right behind me, but my last book was Love Thy Body, which deals with abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, you know, so those are the issues that are the front burner today. And yet, this book was more controversial.
Well, hi there, faithful politics listeners and watchers. If you're joining us via YouTube, we can't wait to have our conversation today. Well, good. Well, in light of that, then we have a great scholar and thinker for you to talk to about all sorts of things. I'm sure she knows a thing or two about the Roman Empire, but our guest today is Professor Nancy Piercy. She's a best-selling author and speaker. A former agnostic, she was hailed in The Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. Her work has appeared in The Washington Post, The Washington Times, First Things, Human Events, American Thinker, Daily Caller, The Federalist, CNS News, and Fox News. And she's appeared on NPR, C-SPAN, and the Fox and Friends. She is currently a professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. Piercy's books have been translated to 19 languages and include Total Truth, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, Love Thy Body, and the one we will talk about today, The Toxic War on Masculinity. Nancy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So I gotta say, I'm super impressed just by the caliber of thinker. I used your book with some students that I had in youth group, Finding Truth. I went through that book with some students, and it was I just loved that book. And so thank you for all the work you've done. But kind of to get a sense of even your story, and you can fill it in a little bit, how did you kind of let us know about Nancy, who you are, how you came to even faith, and then why are you writing a book about the toxic war on masculinity?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked.
Write one, rather.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked because I actually enjoy talking about my conversion. The older I get, it's almost like I appreciate more, that God got a hold of me. So I was raised in a Lutheran home, and I don't know if you know this, but all Scandinavians are Lutheran, the way all Irish are Catholic. It's an ethnic thing. It is. It's an ethnic thing. So my dad's Swedish, my mom's Norwegian, so we were going to be Lutheran.
Of course, you were Lutheran.
And so, but the problem with that is, with an ethnic faith, is that often people rely on the ethnicity, and they don't really have a strong personal commitment. And so when I was in high school, I started just asking questions about my faith. Really, the main one I was asking was just, how do we know it's true? Right? I'm going to a public high school. All my teachers are secular. All my textbooks are secular. And I simply started saying, how do we know this is true? I could answer that. I talked to a Christian college professor, and I asked him point blank, why are you a Christian? He said, works for me. I said, well, you're a college professor. That's all you've got. And I had a chance to talk to a seminary dean, and I thought, okay, I'm going to get something more substantial. But all he said was, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes, as if it were a psychological phase that I would outgrow. So about halfway through high school, I decided, I guess Christianity just doesn't have any answers. And it's up to me. It's up to me. Here's how I thought of it, really. I'm gonna survey all the religions and philosophies out there and figure out which one is really true. And I started walking down the hallway in the public high school I attended and pulling books off the philosophy shelf. Because I thought, wow, if I can't get any, live people to talk to me, maybe these dead guys.
Get some 17th century dead dudes to talk to you.
Or go back to Plato, right? 4th century BC.
Yes.
But I figured this is their job, right? The philosopher's job is to answer questions like, what is truth and how do we know it? And is there a foundation for ethics, or is it just true for me, true for you? Is there meaning to life, or are we just on a rock flying through empty space? And I pretty quickly decided that if there was no God, then the answer to all of those questions was no, there is no meaning to life. There's no foundation for ethics. I even became a skeptic because I thought, how can I, if all I have is my puny brain and the vast scope of time and space and history, what makes me think I could have any sort of universal, overarching, absolute truth, objective truth? Ridiculous. That's how I thought of it at the time. So by the time I graduated from high school, I had absorbed all of these secular isms, from relativism to skepticism, and even determinism, because from my science classes, I learned that we were just complex biochemical machines anyway. So I was very ripe for the kind of apologetics that Francis Schaeffer does. And so Francis Schaeffer had a ministry in Switzerland, which was called L'Abri, which is French for the shelter. It's in the French-speaking part of Switzerland. And I had gone to Europe. We'd lived there when I was a child. My dad had a job over there. So I had gone back. I'd saved all my money through high school so I could go back. And that's how I stumbled across L'Abri. And that's the first time I ever heard any Christians who could engage with the secular ideas, worldviews, philosophies that I had absorbed by that time. I had no idea Christianity could be supported by good reasons, evidence, arguments. I was blown away. So that was a big part of my conversion. It was very much, Christianity had let me down once before. So I was not going to do this unless I was totally intellectually convinced it was true. And so through reading apologetics and so on, that's how I discovered C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton and so on. I eventually came to think, okay, I could spend my whole life learning, but I know enough to be intellectually convinced that it's true. And so that's why I write about apologetics now. All my books, all my teaching is on apologetics because I really want to reach out to young people who had the kind of questions that I had when I was that age.
Just for our audience, to include myself, that aren't familiar with words like apologetic, can you describe what I mentioned this on the show, like I read and study politics and civics. That's sort of like my ballywick, if you will. And like Josh is all about the theology. So apologetics is sort of like a weird term for me. So what is apologetics?
Yeah, that's true. I know it comes from the Greek word. It was actually the Greek word that was used in a court of law. The person who was defending a position or a person was apologia, I think, in Greek. But it just means a defense. And so it's like, you have an idea. You can't just assert it. You can't just claim it. You have to defend it, right? You need to show people why it's reasonable, why there's good reasons for it, why they should maybe consider it. So when a Christian talks to somebody who's maybe not a Christian and just gives them some reasons why they think Christianity's, you can make a good case for the truth of Christianity. That's called apologetics, and sometimes it's biblical apologetics. You've probably heard of it without knowing the word. Like there are people who argue for the reliability of Scripture. For example, how do we know that the New Testament wasn't changed over time, but that we have a reliable record of what the apostles wrote? Or how do we know Jesus rose from the dead? What are some of the arguments, the historical arguments that he really did die, he didn't just swoon, and that that the grave was empty, the tomb was empty afterward. And there's a whole host of arguments there. I was more interested in kind of philosophical arguments. Like I said, what are the arguments against moral relativism? How do we, like I said, I went there as a complete relativist. And actually, that's not so hard. Nobody's truly a moral relativist. Everyone believes there's some things that are right or wrong. I would now say it's because we're made in God's image. We all have a moral sense. But no matter who you talk to, no matter how much they may say, "Oh yeah, I don't really believe there's right and wrong. I follow Nietzsche. I'm a nihilist." Pick something they care about, and maybe it's not the same things you care about. Since you guys are left and right, sort of, the right cares more about abortion, and the left might care more about civil rights. But they both care about something. They both have a moral passion. And so nobody's really a relativist, no matter what they say. And so the trick is to find what it is that they care about and then help them to see that a secular worldview doesn't give the grounds for that. If we're just an accidental collection of atoms, that were cast up by chance, why do we have our ideas about morality? All of our ideals are the products of natural selection. I mean, there are people out there who make this argument. I'm not just making it up. It's called evolutionary psychology. And it's the idea that if our bodies evolved, so did our brains and all of our feelings. And so everything we think not because it's true, but because it had survival value at some point. At some point, it helped our species to the point of view. Something like, your own moral passions cannot be explained within a secular context, but the Christian context will explain it. So, you kind of help people who are maybe thinking through whether to become a Christian or whether even to consider it. Here's some of the reasons.
Oh, okay. So, that makes sense. And I've never had anybody explain it to me as well as you have, to include my pastor, actually.
Hold on.
So I want to talk to you about your book. So The Toxic War on Masculinity. I want to maybe have you explain what it's all about, and then also I don't know how much input you had on your title for your book, but it's The Toxic War on Masculinity, not the war on toxic masculinity. And I thought that was sort of interesting. I don't know if it's just like just a play on words, or if there's some, deeper meaning behind sort of the phrasing.
It's mostly a play on words. I wanted to get both words in there because that is, that's what's going to catch attention. Mm-hmm. But I didn't want to use the phrase toxic masculinity because that implies that you think masculinity is toxic, that there is such a thing. And so you're right. I mostly just played around with it because, and it's proven to be a good thing. I mean, people do sort of do a double take, like, what? Wait, what? So it does what titles are supposed to do, arouse interest.
Yeah. So what's the book about?
Yeah. So, I wanted to write the book because I was trying to understand why has it become so socially acceptable to launch, hostile missives against men and masculinity. For example, the Washington Post had an article titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" I thought, really? In a respected mainstream publication? Or a Huffington Post editor tweeted, #KillAllMen. And that's supposed to be funny.
Wow.
You can buy T-shirts that say, "So many men, so little ammunition." And then this...
Whoa. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh about that.
It makes you laugh. And then on the other hand, you say, you couldn't say that about any other group. And then there's some books that have come out with titles that are incredibly blunt, like "I Hate Men," and "No Good Men," and "Are Men Necessary?" And to my surprise, there are even some men who are jumping on the bandwagon. A fairly well-known male author wrote a book in which he said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. And then this one you guys might have actually seen because it was in the news a couple months ago now. But did you see the director of the movie Avatar, James Cameron, was in the news because he said, testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. So no wonder. One study I found said 46% of American men agreed with the statement, these days society seems to punish men just for acting like men. And that's almost half of men. So whether you agree with that or not, that is a lot of people, a lot of men who think that men are getting a bad deal these days. And so that's really what caught my attention at first. You can't really stand against a social trend unless you ask, where did it come from? How did it develop?
Right.
And so I spent a good bit of the book just, where did the secular script for masculinity come from? How did we get to Britain? The rubber hits the road. How did we get to the point where our own teenagers are fans of Andrew Tate? I did get an email from a former graduate student just a few days ago. She teaches high school. And she said, all of my male students are fans of Andrew Tate. They're even putting quotes from Andrew Tate in the yearbook. She teaches at a classical Christian school.
Oh my goodness.
So it is permeated everywhere. The fast cars, fast money, fast women.
Yeah.
Paradigm of masculinity is really catching on, unfortunately. So that's why I think it's important to deal with.
That makes a lot of sense. I've been interested in this for a long time, just thinking about in general, the sense in which masculinity, it seems like it's shifting. It seems like it's even hard. Like it even feels weird sometimes to say masculinity, like in a context of a positive way, like you said, and referred to certain people saying that, any masculinity is like cancer. What was it that good masculinity is like healthy masculinity is like healthy cancer, which is like, whoa. So what is toxic masculinity, quote unquote? Why has it been like, how is it being portrayed? And what have you found out about why is it being portrayed like, how do we get here where now masculinity is in the crosshairs?
Yeah, well, I'll give you sort of a quick nutshell of the history because most people think it's probably out of the 1960s, second wave feminism. If you listen to the manosphere, right, it's all those evil feminists. No. You have to go much further back. You have to go back to the Industrial Revolution. Because before that, men worked alongside their families, their wives and children all day on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the cultural expectation on men really focused on their caretaking role. Fathers were expected to spend just as much time with their children as mothers did. And in fact, one of the most interesting historical facts that I found was most of the literature on parenting back then was addressed to fathers. Like if you go to a bookstore today, right, they're almost all to mothers. But back then they were all addressed to fathers. That was so interesting because they expected the father to be the one who had the primary responsibility. And even the concept of authority back then was the person in charge of the common good. In other words, I look out for what's good for me, you look out for what's good for you. But who looks out for the common good? Whether it's of the marriage, of the family, of the church, of civil society, and so on. And that's what authority was for. It was for being, you were not supposed to look out for your own interest. The favorite word of the day was disinterested. And what that meant is, you were not supposed to look out your own interest. You were supposed to look out for the interest of the whole, the family. And fathers were even expected to bring that nurturing, caretaking ethos into the public realm, because a common phrase back then was they were to be fathers of the community, so they were not supposed to just be, a little nuclear family. So where did we lose that really positive view of masculinity? Oh, and even a secular historian puts it this way. He said that the dominant concept of masculine virtue was duty to God and man. That sounds very colonial, doesn't it? Where did we lose
Yes,
that?
indeed.
So the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. And of course, men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time, men were not working with their family members, with people they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And that's when you see the literature start to change. People began to protest. They didn't like it. They began to protest that men were losing that caretaking ethos of the colonial era, that they were becoming individualistic, self-interested, egocentric, greedy, and acquisitive, using the language of the day. Look out for number one. Turning their career into an idol. That was the language of the day as well. And so if you read, newspaper articles of the time, people were very concerned that men were changing. And this is the first time you start to see negative language applied to the male character. And of course, knowing where it came from gives us some hints of how to fix it. If it was the disconnect of the father from the family, then it's clear that the solution has to be finding ways to reconnect fathers with their families. And so I do have a whole chapter on sort of practical ways that we might be able to tweak the workplace even today to help fathers have more time with their kids. The New York Times, by the way, just had an article with this title. It said, during the pandemic, fathers got closer to their children and they don't want to lose that. And it was about how a lot of fathers don't want to go back to the office full time. They'd like maybe a hybrid situation or something like that so that they can keep that closeness that, they found out they like their kids during the pandemic. I think that's a very positive development.
Yeah, so can we just, I don't know, take a step back maybe and just define what does it mean to be masculine?
Well, you know what? This is a very fact-based book. I give the facts of sociology, and I give a lot of historical facts. It's the most data-driven book I've written. And in fact, yesterday I was on a podcast, and the guy said, I never did figure out what your position was. Oh, good. Good. I wasn't writing to show my position. But it has been the most controversial book I've written, which did take me by surprise. I mean, my last book, which is right behind me, my last book was Love Thy Body, which deals with abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, so those are the issues that are the front burner today. And yet this book was more controversial. When I was in the process of writing it, I like to get lots of feedback to rub off the rough edges, right? And they would tell their family and friends. And so these were people who were not actually reading it, but just hearing about it. And the first question invariably was, whose side is she on? With that tone, whose side is she on? And oh, by the way, the second question was always, and why is a woman writing a book on masculinity anyway?
Nice.
But men just tended to assume that if I'm a female writer, I am a male-bashing feminist. And more progressive people tended to assume I was an angry, reactionary, defensive culture warrior. And so I rewrote the first chapter multiple times because I had to sort of overcome that initial suspicion. And so in that chapter, I started out with a study by a sociologist. I told you it's fact-based. A sociologist did a really interesting study that was very helpful. So he's invited to speak all around the world because he's very well known. And he came up with a very clever experiment where he asked young men 2 questions. First, he asked them, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man. What does that mean? And the sociologist said all around the world, young men had no trouble answering that. They would immediately say honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, help the little guy. I like that one. Be a protector, be a provider, be responsible. And the sociologist would say, where'd you learn that? And they'd say, I don't know, it's just in the air we breathe. Or if they were in a Western country, they would often say it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. And then he would follow up with a second question, and he would ask, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young man would say, oh, no, that's completely different. No, that means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, play through pain. What else? Be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language. So the sociologists concluded it appears that all around the world, men do have an innate, inherent sense of what it means to be the good man. Like I said, these were not Christian countries. They were, every country around the globe, from Brazil to Sweden to Australia, whatever. They do have this innate sense, and I would say they're made in God's image, right? And so they do have a sense of what it means to be the good man, provide, protect, care for those that they love. But they also feel cultural pressure to be the quote unquote real man, which tends to be the more toxic characteristics, and especially if decoupled from a moral ideal, it can slide into dominance, entitlement, coercion, and so on. And so I think this gives us a better way to approach these issues too, because men don't respond very well to being called toxic, right? Nobody would. So what we can do is we can see, can we tap into that innate, inherent sense they have of what it means to be the good man? Can we tap into that and encourage and support and affirm them in their aspiration to be a good man? And I think that will make it'll give us a much more positive way to approach these issues.
Okay. I really appreciate you, you saying that you're not necessarily taking a position, because it's almost like whenever you see the words toxic and masculinity kind of in the same sentence, it's almost like a dog whistle for both sides, right? Like so the right wants to say, we are, feminizing, we're feminizing men, we're letting them, I don't know, go to musicals or whatever, like, I don't know what the thing is. I like musicals. So, and then like on the left, it's like, it's viewed as a critique, a cultural critique, and I'll be honest, like when Josh told me you were going to come on the show, obviously I did my research. I was like, oh, I wonder where she stands on this. And like, but it makes sense. Like, you're not necessarily trying to appease one side or the other. You're looking at data, you're looking at facts, I do think that probably maybe some of the, media that you've shown up on would, make people think that you lean more one way than the other. But I don't necessarily get that, Daily Caller, Federalist, Fox News, stuff like that. But anyways, that wasn't my question. My question is like, comparing like secular masculinity, like how does that differ than like biblical, say, masculinity? Because I know you've written quite a bit about this, and I'd love to kind of get your take on the difference between the two.
Yeah, well, there's been some sociological and psychological studies done on Christian men. And actually, that was the final trigger that made me decide I was going to write this book, because I started reading some of this literature and I thought, this is great stuff. Nobody knows about it. So basically what happened is, of course, Christian men are often held up as exhibit A of toxic masculinity, theologically conservative Christian men. If you believe in any notion of a headship in the home, for example, it was very easy to find accusations with a quick Google search. But I'll give you just one. So this was the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which came after the Me Too movement. And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. And so the social scientists were reading these accusations and saying, where's your evidence? You're making these charges. Where's your data? And so they went out and did the studies. And in my book, I quote some dozen or so studies where they found out exactly the opposite. They found out that committed Christian men who are really living out their faith test out as the best, on top of the heap. In other words, they test out as the most loving husbands, and by the way, it's their wives who they do test the wives separately, which is important. And so the wives are reporting the highest level of happiness with their husband's expression of love and affection. Evangelical men spend the most time with their children, 3.5 hours more per week with their children than secular men, both in shared activities like church youth group and sports, and in terms of discipline, like setting limits on screen time or enforcing bedtime. Evangelical couples divorce at the lowest rate of any major group in America, 35% lower than secular men. And then the real surprise is they have the lowest level of domestic abuse and violence. And so when I started reading this material, I thought this needs to get out. I had to dig into the academic literature to find this, reading academic journals. And I thought, why don't we know this? Christian churches need to know that committed Christian church-going fathers are doing a very good job compared to the rest of the culture, because Christian men feel beaten down too. I mean, when I told my class that I was writing a book on masculinity, a male student shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." So I thought, oh, okay. And it's also good, I think, for sort of apologetics purpose, if I can use that term again, in the sense of we need to bring this information out into the public to debunk the secular narrative that says Christian men are uniquely toxic, because this isn't just a pep talk from a religious leader. Right? This is solid empirical evidence out of the social sciences. It's evidence-based findings that Christianity does have the power to reconcile the sexes, as I put it in the subtitle of my book. And you asked about the secular versus the Christian. So I gave you the Christian, so the secular, it could have sort of by contrast.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting when I hear you talk, because I'm thinking, like, in light of what I think that Will was kind of alluding to, is that looking at the title of your book, looking at some of the publications, maybe, I mean, of course, the Washington Post certainly isn't, they're no way close to the right. But looking at all of that, like, someone would think, oh yeah, they're going to try to already predict what I already know what she's going to say. And I think that probably has a lot to do with the fact that you've proclaimed you're a Christian, whatever it is, or evangelical, that word. And I'm sure we could go all day, and you should, maybe your next book is going to be on ex-evangelicals and this deconstruction movement that isn't really what deconstruction is, but no one really cares about that. They just, they like the word. So, but what I was going to say is that how do you feel like your faith has affected, number one, your view of masculinity and what the standard should be? And number two, how does it affect maybe even your pre-understanding as you come to these studies and you come to this data? Like, how did you even maybe work against that bias that you may have as you're coming to this data?
The opposite bias. I had absolutely the opposite bias. Okay, if you read my book, you realize that in the introduction, I talk about my childhood, which was severely abusive. My father was very physically abusive. In books on abuse, they often ask, was it open hand or closed fist? And it was closed fist. It was a knuckle fist. That was his favorite, to make a sharper stab of pain. So I came out of my childhood, ricocheted all the way to extreme feminist, as you can imagine.
Right, yeah.
All of the feminist books. I loved them. Starting, with Betty Friedan and Simone de Beauvoir, Kate Millett. I mean, everyone I thought was better than the last. I always had some feminist book on my bedside table. And so that's why I put that story at the beginning, so people would realize, well, even when I started this book, I was kind of, I'm not so sure where I stand on these issues. I mean, I had had a lot of emotional and psychological healing from my past. I should say that part, because I had a Christian psychologist pick up my book, and he said, when I first picked it up, I read that opening introduction. I thought, oh no. He said, oh no, an abused woman who's angry at men. And it doesn't come across that way. It does not come across as angry at men. But that's because I did have to go through years and years of emotional and spiritual healing. I mentioned that I became a Christian at a ministry called L'Abri, which is in Switzerland. And I've told that story a couple times, but I've never told this side before until this book. Also at L'Abri is where I started the emotional healing from the trauma of my childhood. On staff was a psychiatric social worker. Her name was Sheila Bird, and we called her Birdie. And it was Birdie who helped me to realize that I could not just walk away from my past, because that's what I tried to do, right? It was so painful that I thought, I'm going to completely suppress it. I'm going to start over with a blank slate and recreate my whole self from scratch. That was my goal. And of course, that doesn't work. You have to actually work through that trauma. And here's part of it that I didn't even put in the book. But people ask me, why would you go to a Christian ministry if you were not a Christian? The reason I went to L'Abri is because I had family members who were traveling through and who were stopping there. They're sort of touristy Christians, oh, let's stop and see this ministry. Well, my parents were among the first of those touristy Christians because my dad had been teaching overseas. He was teaching in Turkey right before the military coup. At any rate, so Birdie saw my dad. Birdie had a chance to actually see my father. And
my word.
And she said to me, when we met then, she said to me, I looked at your father and I thought, there is a man who oppresses everyone around him. She hadn't even heard my story yet. She just looked at him. and it's a good thing. I mean, I had so suppressed it, I might not have even talked about it. You know what I mean? It was not part of my conscious, daily memory anymore. So it probably was good that she saw him, because then when I came to speak with her, she's like, okay, this is what we're talking about. All that to say, though, from the beginning of my Christian life, I had both this really rich intellectual understanding, which was great, but I also had an incredibly rich personal, emotional, experiential side of Christianity, of, learning to experience the healing of all of these memories from the past, of experiencing God's love, in such a real way that it healed all of those emotional wounds.
I really appreciate you talking about kind of your earlier past, and especially kind of like your journey kind of through feminism. Because as you're talking, I'm wondering, like, is masculinity in conflict with feminism, kind of as you see it? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, part of it is there's so many different definitions of feminism. First wave, second wave, third wave. I've heard people say we're now in the fourth wave. I haven't quite heard what that one is yet. And the first wave feminists, the early feminists, 19th century, were very different. For example, they were all pro-life. They were against abortion. People like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and so on. I mean, that's a huge difference. And many of them were very pro-family. Their goal, when they saw that, women were having babies outside of marriage and that this could be a social problem, they didn't call for abortion. They called for male sexual control, male sexual restraint.
That'll never happen. Not in this country.
And I actually read one historian. He's at Peter Stearns at George Mason University. And he said it worked. He said, he's a number cruncher. He's a historian. And he says, the number of births went down before the invention of birth control. And he said, why is that?
Wow.
Historians have looked at it and said, why is that? What happened? And he said, the only thing we can figure out is women said to their husbands, there's only so many babies I can have. It takes a lot out of you physically. We have to we have to practice sexual restraint. And so historians actually agree that with the early feminists, that male sexual restraint was their answer to unrestrained, sexuality that gives rise to babies outside of marriage. At any rate, so the first wave was very different. The second wave, like Betty Friedan, when I finally stopped calling myself a feminist, I remember the day. It was one day.
Wow.
I was always getting, like I said, always getting books. And one of my books that I got from the library, saved money, get them from the library, was Nancy Friday's book, My Mother, Myself. Nancy Friday was maybe a second-tier feminist, not totally famous, but sort of second famous. And in this book, if you had this problem, it's because your mother did this to you. And if you had that problem, it's because your mother did this to you. And I finally said, where's the solutions? I'm tired of being a victim. That's what I said. I literally said, I'm tired of being a victim. Because this book is all about always seeing yourself as a victim. In this case of your mother. The sort of Freudian thing, your mother's always the reason you have your problems. I put that book away. I didn't finish reading it, and I stopped calling myself a feminist. Now, I was drawn into pro-life feminism. Have you heard of them? There's a group that, oh really, there's a group. There's an actual organization who call themselves pro-life feminists. And so women with a feminist background, but who have, who are against abortion. And so I stayed with them for a while because, okay, I can handle that. But
it's feminism light, sort of, right?
But really, when feminism in the 70s, it tended to get more and more. It was about lesbianism and abortion. For a while, NOW, the official organizations, that was sort of the main things they focused on. And I began to realize that calling myself a feminist might be misleading. If I wasn't for abortion and lesbianism, it might be misleading to call myself a feminist, because people would naturally think, well, okay, you line up with the official organizations. So I did stop calling myself a feminist. But anyway, so that's the history. So the answer is it depends on which feminism you're talking about, and how it relates to masculinity. For example, I'll give you a concrete example. So Betty Friedan, her view matched up very closely to the Playboy mentality. So she wasn't against masculinity in that form. She literally, I quote her in my book, because she literally sympathized with men who were divorcing their wives for younger, sexier models. She said, because women are infantilized, women are millstones around their husbands' necks, women are parasites on their husband. She had language like that, which pretty much matched up with what Hugh Hefner was saying, who was saying, don't get married. Marriage is going to, in one of the earliest Playboy magazines, he said, marriage will tie down men's natural adventure-loving spirit. And I thought, well, he and Betty Friedan were actually saying the same thing. So sometimes they actually lined up in their views. Anyway, that's we can keep going on that question, but maybe you want another one.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking as you're talking about the fact that we take categories and we just put them over so many different diverse people. And so like the comment that if I said I was a feminist, it would be misunderstood. It's so funny because these words just change so much that when you say one thing, like even masculinity in 10 years, I'm not even going to be sure if I'm in the same ballpark. We're even playing the same game. We're even thinking about the same game when we're using these kinds of words. Where do you think that comes from? Where has this shift come from? Is it secular influence on masculinity? And if it is, how has secularism influenced it in such a profound way? In what ways is it saying, here's masculinity, here's femininity, and this is why masculinity is bad?
Yeah, so in the book, I do go through several stages of secularization. One of my favorite, I have a whole chapter on Darwinian evolution. Most people think of evolution as having to do with, genes and fossils, science. But they don't realize it had an enormous impact on the secular definition of masculinity. So Darwinian thinkers began to say that the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival had to be rugged, ruthless, brutal, barbarian, savage, and sexually predatory. I'm using their language. And so their idea was, well, whereas Christianity had urged men to live up to the image of God in them, evolutionary thinkers began to urge men to live down to their animal nature, the beast within, which was their favorite phrase, that this is your authentic self. And by the way, and Darwin also did say explicitly that women were intellectually inferior to men. So if that's part of toxic masculinity, he bears some responsibility for that as well.
Thanks, Darwin.
And it's not just historical, because that was called social Darwinism, but it's come back in our own day under the label evolutionary psychology, right? I just mentioned it a minute ago, where if your body has evolved, then so has your brain and all your feelings and emotions. So it's called evolutionary psychology. And there's a best-selling book on the subject, best-selling, so it's had a huge impact, called The Moral Animal. And the author says, the human male is a possessive, oppressive, flesh-obsessed pig. Trying to teach him how to have a successful marriage is like giving Vikings a booklet on how not to pillage. I thought, okay, yeah, that's still the message of evolution. And then there's another one, by the way. Have you seen this? It's just been reissued. George Gilder's book, Men in Marriage, which is an older book, but just reissued. And he also, coming from an evolutionary perspective, says a man he uses language like violent, irresponsible, sexually predatory. His deepest impulse is to get on his motorbike and ride off into the sunset like a Lone Ranger. He doesn't want to be tied down to marriage and family, and then he says, but it takes a woman to tame him. So a woman has to civilize this man. And I'm thinking, wait a minute.
It's kind of like the Epic of Gilgamesh. When remember the prostitute makes whatever Enkidu like he makes him civilized. Yeah, well, exactly. Gilder goes so far as to say a man has to accept the woman's morality, and it's civilization is shaped by the woman's morality. To which I say, don't tell men. They have to submit to a woman's morality. What man's going to do that? A man is called to God's morality. God is the one who tells us who a man and woman is. What it means to be masculine or feminine. I'm very much opposed to this message that, it's up to women to tame men. Like women are better, men are more naturally prone to sin and vice. And by the way, if you want to go into that, I have a whole section on that in the book as well. Where did we get this idea that women are naturally morally superior and men are just naturally more prone to sin and vice, and women have to tame them? That also came out of the 19th century. Nobody said that before the 19th century. That's distinctively modern point of view.
It's so weird, and I'm wondering, how much do you think like our culture, our society, politics in particular, play into how we view masculinity? Because so far, I don't think you've said anything that I would disagree with. But like whenever, we talk about, masculinity, role of the man, role of the woman, role of the man, role of the woman, and like Josh Hawley, the senator, he wrote a book called Manhood, the Masculine Virtue America Needs. So help me kind of better understand like the role, and maybe if not the role, the effect, politics and other cultural influences has on this. Because as a Democrat, I'm just naturally inclined to blame everything on the Republicans. But I know there's probably there's some bigger forces at work here.
Well, of course, one of the questions I got when I was writing the book was, well, what do you think are the differences between men and women? And so I had to put that at the front, right? Let's start with the basic biology, right? Men are bigger, stronger, faster. They have 75% greater upper body muscle mass, 90% greater strength, upper body strength. And here's one I just read. It was something like 300%. I'll have to look it up. Something like 300% greater punch power. So any woman who's been abused knows that one. And because of testosterone, of course, men are more aggressive and more risk-taking on average. And I think what we have to say is this is how they were created. We have to say that the basic way that God created men is good. And we should be grateful for their unique masculine strengths. I'll give you another study. This was also very intriguing because it was global. I love these studies when they're global because you realize it's not just individual culture. It's not just, Western culture or whatever. This was the first cross-cultural study ever done on concepts of masculinity. It's done by an anthropologist, not a Christian. And of course, what he found is cultures differ to some degree to what they think masculinity is. Some societies are more warlike, others are more peaceful. But they all agreed, he found, on what the anthropologists called the 3 Ps, that the good man will provide, protect, and procreate, meaning, become a father, build into the next generation, build into the future. And I thought, that's great. It's kind of like the other study I mentioned, where it seems to be an inherent, innate knowledge that men have universally, that they're made in God's image, and that unique masculine strength that they do have is not given them to get whatever they want, to dominate other people, to subjugate other people, but it is to provide, protect, care for, and maybe sometimes they might have to fight for the people that they love. And this was so encouraging to me when I read this, because what it means is, well, we might call it general revelation, right? General revelation is that theological term that means what we can tell just from living in God's creation, being made in God's image. Special revelation is the Bible, and general revelation is what we can know just from living in God's creation. It seems to be part of general revelation that men do know what it means to be the good man, and they do aspire to use their strength for good. And again, it was not a Christian, you can't say it was biased because he wasn't a Christian. It wasn't a Western culture. It was universal. And so, or Romans 2, maybe that's another way to refer to it, right? Paul says we all have a conscience. We all have a sense of right or wrong, whatever our cultural background is. So to come back to your question, as you can see, I keep coming back to the fact in what is good about masculinity and be grateful for it. Of course, we have to affirm what's good about femininity as well. The reason people are concerned about acknowledging differences is that almost always, if you acknowledge a difference, one will be less than, will be considered less than. One will be considered inferior, a subordinate, or whatever. And so people are very nervous. I'm very nervous about acknowledging differences. And so if you do acknowledge the difference, you have to say that women's difference are also strengths. The unique, most things are not unique. Okay. If you talk about personality traits, they overlap very closely. So even a trait like aggression, which surprised me, aggression, you get a bell curve for men and you get a bell curve for women, and they overlap very closely. So there's a lot of women who are actually more aggressive than a lot of men. And they differ mostly at the ends, which is why 95% of the prison inmates are male. They're over at that women and men are more alike than they are different. When Adam sees Eve for the first time, he doesn't say, oh, somebody different from me. No, he says, somebody like me. Bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. How exciting. And so it's important to keep that in mind. And then when we do acknowledge the differences, that we acknowledge both as strengths, so that, what's different, what's unique to women is that, their superpower is that they have children, and they have a lot of psychological abilities that go with that. They do test out higher on tests of emotional intelligence. And a lot of that's because when you have a baby, when you have an infant and the infant is in distress, you have to drop everything and meet their distress. You don't argue with them. You don't reason with them. You don't scold them. You don't punish them. You meet their distress. No matter what you're doing, no matter if it's 3:00 in the morning, you have to learn how to be willing to meet another person's need at the drop of a hat. You need to learn patience. You need to learn gentleness. you need to become extremely sensitive to nonverbal cues because this baby's not talking. And women become very sensitive to, by the way, these are all, I'm talking about studies that have been done. So another thing the studies show is that women become very sensitive to threats in the environment because in a sense they have to take on the threats to the environment, to their children. They become mama bears. And so it's important that we always, when we talk about the differences, I'm very sensitive to the fact that it's all, well, men are stronger. Well, women are stronger. You know, they also have their strengths. The differences are not a strength versus a weakness. It's a strength versus a strength. And if we focused on that, you know, I think we would take a lot of the fire out of these debates.
Right.
Yeah, just real fast, Josh. You know, when you talk about that, I always go back to my wife who gave birth to both of our boys natural, like no, you know, I don't know how people give birth unnaturally, but but basically like she wanted the whole experience. Like she's like, I don't want drugs. I'm just going to do my hypnotherapy, you know, work through my pressure waves. And like I would have zero desire to do that if I were able to get pregnant. Yes. I'd be like, just give me all the drugs. Like just let me forget the whole experience, you know?
My wife is so much stronger than me, like emotionally. Which that's what makes it, I feel like, I mean, strength, physical strength is awesome. And I say that a bit tongue in cheek, but I mean, emotional strength is what gets you through life and what allows you to cooperate with other people and what allows you to get the most accomplished. I would think, and I would think that studies would bear that out. Mike, this is kind of the last question just for the sake of time. But it's really fascinating, even hearing your story about how you were a survivor of abuse and how difficult that was. And we've had several people on this podcast who've come on and they've talked to us about how Christian in particular, the thing you've kind of referred to before, but this idea that the headship in the home, Christian headship in the home, headship for men in the home has been abused, has been a breeding ground for abuse is what I've heard. We have had Kristen Dumais. We've had, Beth Allison Bart, right? Yeah, we had both of them on the show and talk about their books. What kind of solutions do you kind of drive towards when thinking about the idea of how this has been abused or is being abused, or is it? That's kind of the question. So how do you deal with that?
I'm very glad that you asked that before the end because for the sake of balance, you know, I talked about how the social scientists found that committed Christian men test out the highest. You know what? Let me give you a quote. Sometimes a quote will crystallize it. My go-to sociologist, the one who I quote the most often, and he did the largest study. And he's also a very prominent marriage sociologist who writes he's Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia. And his stature is such that he writes in places like the New York Times. So this is an article in the New York Times. And he says, it turns out just conservatives. Of course, they always refer to the wives because the assumption is that it breeds abuse. You know, it's oppressive and tyrannical and coercive to the wives. So it turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high-quality marriages. And then he turns, hold on, I just lost it in my notes. He turns to his, I think I can remember it by heart. Anyway, he turns to his fellow sociologists, who of course are mostly secular. So sociologist tends to be a highly secularized field. And he says, academics need to cast aside their prejudices against religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular. evangelical Protestant married family men with children are the most engaged fathers and the most loving husbands. And I'm like, wait, nobody knows this. That's amazing. And the first
I've never heard that.
I know. Right. I mean, that's why you have to read my book. These quotes are just astonishing. And by the way, you might like to know that Wilcox himself is not evangelical. He's Catholic. And so I'm not sure that he was all that happy to find out that Protestant evangelicals test out better than Catholics do. Because he did another study on Catholics. and he did a study on mainline Protestants and Jews, as well as secular men. And they tend to rank sort of like that. Evangelicals on top, Catholics and Jews, and mainlines sort of in the middle, sort of clustered in the middle, and secular men on the bottom of these measures of, being good husbands and fathers. At any rate, the pushback I get, though, is, haven't we all heard that evangelicals, or that Christians, divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture? And in my research, I found that actually is one of the most widely quoted statistics by Christian leaders. And so what happened is
absolutely.
You've heard it, right? You've probably said it.
Probably have said it, yes.
So the researchers went back to the data, and this was especially Brad Wilcox at UVA. He did the largest study, and he broke out evangelical couples who are truly committed, attend church regularly, from nominal Christians. And in America, we have a lot of nominals. But my students don't know what the word nominal means, so I have to explain. N-O-M is Latin for name. So it means in name only. And so these are men who, in a survey like this, might check the Baptist box, for example. But they actually don't attend church, or rarely, if at all. It's mostly a cultural family background thing. And these men test out shockingly different. They fit all the toxic stereotypes. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness of any group. They spend the least amount of time with their children. They divorce at a higher rate even than secular men. 20 have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence, higher than secular men. So this is the shock. If you were to do a study on evangelicals, you're going to get misleading numbers because you're getting men who are better than secular men and men who are worse than secular men. And so your numbers are not going to be, this is going to be skewed. And it also suggests what we're up against, right? Because I still think churches should be more supportive and encouraging to Christian men who are doing a good job. One of my graduate students is the head of a very large, women's ministry in a very large Baptist church. And she said to me, on Mother's Day, we hand out roses and we tell mothers they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. So I think we need to stop scolding the men. I tried very hard not to have a scolding tone in this book, even when I talked about things I thought were toxic. I think we want Christian churches to be more encouraging to the men who are doing well. And again, this isn't, it's not just pep talk. It's scientific data. But we also have to ask, how can the church reach out to these nominal men who are identifying as evangelical, but who are, in a sense, ruining the reputation of evangelicals because they are actually more toxic? I have had people say, well, why would they end up being even more toxic than secular men? And apparently it's because they feel religious justification, right? So your average secular guy out there who's maybe hitting his wife and kids doesn't feel any religious justification for it. But the nominal Christian does. He's taking words like headship and submission, religious terminology, but he's importing secular meanings. He's defining headship according to the secular script for masculinity. But then he feels justified. He feels like, okay, I'm okay with God acting like this, when I slap up my wife. So he ends up actually being worse than secular men. So that's what we're up against. I would say in the church is, how in the world do we reach out to these men and disciple them better and help them to really come to a better biblical understanding of what it means. I'll give you one concrete example. When the studies were done of committed Christian men, I was surprised. By the way, I was surprised. I was blown away by the positive data, the outcomes of the studies.
Yeah.
And with my background, I did not expect that. Yeah, I was really blown away that when they actually interviewed Christian men, right? Because the secular culture is saying the theology turns men into overbearing patriarchs. So I wanted to say, well, does it? Does it? That's an empirical question, right? So I went to the empirical data, and the committed Christian men, the most frequent Bible verse they quoted was Ephesians 5, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And I thought, and then I turned to the secular men, the nominal men. And many of them said they never even heard that verse. They literally said
wow.
that. I'll give you two examples. One was a woman whose husband was abusive. She said, when I heard that Ephesians 5, the one to husbands, I didn't believe it. I'd never heard a sermon on that. I had to go look it up in the Bible myself to find out if it was really even there. And then another story was of a pastor who counsels abusive men. They're in court-ordered counseling. That's about the only time they get counseling, is if it's court-ordered. So there's a Christian pastor who's involved in that counseling, and he was being abusive to his wife. She had a court order against him, which he had broken, and the pastor was trying to tell him, that it helped him to see what he was doing wrong, and the man couldn't see it. He kept saying, Ephesians 5, she's supposed to submit to me, so she's wrong. She shouldn't leave the house. She should come back and submit to me. And the pastor said, let's go a few more verses down. Let's look at what the same Ephesians 5 says to pastors. And the pastor who's writing this up said, the guy was shocked. He had never heard that verse, that husbands love your wife as Christ loved the church. And he had to admit that he was not doing that. So I thought that was amazing. It's such a contrast between
that is amazing.
Christian men and the nominal men.
Oh, that's an unbelievable data point. And that's not just a data point, but it's like a theme that's like amazing to bring out and just to make sure I get it. And then I'm going to ask you the last technical question, which is just, I say technical. It's just like, it's not like a deep question. It's just like, but anyway, so, they attend church regularly? Is that, so what makes them committed as opposed to nominal, I guess, if you could just help us see that real quick.
It is surprising, but true, that social scientists have discovered that you can pretty much judge it just by the whether they go to church. Something so concrete, something so quantifiable. There have been studies that try to dig deeper, right? There's studies that, well, how important is your religion to you? How often do you pray? Do you feel God's presence? There are studies that have asked deeper questions like that, but they have found, surprisingly, it pretty much lines up with just, do you go to church? Do you go to church regularly? And so now a lot of studies that I've seen, a lot of them just focus on, do you go to church 3 times a month or more? And that tends to be a pretty good, pretty reliable measure of how committed a man is or how nominal he is.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, Nancy, how can people keep up with your work, and where can they find the book where they can purchase it?
Well, you can get it at Amazon like everything else, right?
Like everything else in the world.
Although if you prefer, you can get it at places like christianbook.com. And you can come to my website. My publisher very generously redesigned my website so it's colorful and fun. And you can peruse my other books and find out what else I've written. And you can leave a message. Oh, the address. I forgot to say the address. NancyPiercy.com. And Piercy is Pearcey. So NancyPiercy.com. And there's a place where you can leave comments. So I read them. I don't have time to answer all of them, but I read them. So come on by NancyPiercy.com. Come along and say hello.
Well, thank you. That's awesome. Well, guys, this has been Professor Nancy Piercy with her new book, The Toxic War on Masculinity. I almost said the war on toxic masculinity. It's like the toxic war on masculinity. We've so enjoyed having you on the show with us today. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you. I have really enjoyed it as well. You guys are great to talk to.
Well, thank you. And guys, until next time, don't keep your conversations left or right, but up, and we'll see you then. Bye.